Okay, I want to reference an interesting section of Chapter 11 of Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. It's a description using a developing child who is completely sequestered from any kind of stimulation, including that he is fed intravenously. It's an example, so he doesn't have the sensory pleasure of eating or sensory experience of eating. And it's an example, and as we know, Pirsig is great at explaining with examples to illustrate the proposition of David Hume that thoughts are not innate, that there's nothing in there, there's nothing innate. Everything is construction of perceptions. So I'm going to read that right now. Suppose a child is born devoid of all senses. He has no sight, no hearing, no touch, no smell, no taste, nothing. There's no way whatsoever for him to receive any sensations from the outside world. And suppose this child is fed intravenously and otherwise attended to and kept alive for 18 years in this state of existence. The question is then asked, does this 18-year-old person have a thought in his head? If so, where does it come from? How does he get it? Hume would have answered that the 18-year-old has no thought whatsoever. So the reality of this isn't exactly true because we know that we are born with a temperament. Any mother will tell you that one child has, is maybe extroverted and the other one is more sensitive, more fussy, let's just say. So we do come out with some innate behavioral stuff at least. And we do have some hardwiring of that nature, which then interacts with the environment, and there's a back and forth that creates our thoughts, and later social patterns give us the language for this stuff, and the ghosts, of course. But we interpret the world as we develop through the lens that we're given, so there are innate traits. In terms of thought, that's an interesting question, or in terms of any experience a child would have that was deprived. That's an interesting question. So what would it actually be like now that we have all this neuroscience that describes, that can actually understand some of this stuff on a scientific level? What would it actually be like for a child that has no stimulation? So I want to read from, this is Gabor Mate, and this is a great book on ADD, by the way, if you have ADD, which a lot of people do. Kids who develop with a lot of social media. I think this is becoming a bigger problem, not for the reasons Gabor Mate names, which is childhood deprivation, but of some sort, some attachment disorder of some sort, coupled with a sensitive nature. But now we've got a whole generation whose brains are developing around social media, so it's going to be a different kind of ADD, I think. But anyway, I want to read an example that sort of parallels that. So neural Darwinism means that our genetic potential for brain development can find its full expression only if circumstances are favorable. To understand this, we need only imagine an infant kept in a dark room, held, physically cared for, and fed, but never spoken to. After a year of such deprivation, the brain of this infant would not be comparable to those of other infants, no matter what her inherited potential. Despite perfectly good eyes at birth and healthy nerves to conduct visual images to the brain, the 30 or so neurological units that together make up visual sense would not develop. Even neurological components for vision present at birth would atrophy and become useless if the child never saw light for about 5 years. Irreversible blindness would be the result. If we surround the child with silence for the first 10 years, he would never be able to learn human speech. So the circumstances aren't exactly the same, but it's an interesting reflection, tragic one in some ways, because this has actually happened. One of the most devastating studies of all time was this Spitzer study, I think his name is. And this early clip reveals to you what happens when the child is really deprived, was neglected, and deprived of touch, I think, was the main variable in this study. And these clips are always shown, if you're studying mental health, you will see one of these clips, because it's an example of very profound attachment problems. And these clips are always shown in the context of attachment theory, which of course everyone studies now because that's one of the most heavily studied aspects of development in the context of mental health, and it should be. So this is a little upsetting. You'll see the blank look, the self-soothing with the rocking back and forth of deprived children. So these children will fail to thrive. They just don't develop, and often they die. It's said, and I think Jordan Peterson brought this up once when talking about Rousseau, who just had a bunch of babies and threw them in the orphanages, that basically, at the turn of the between the 18th and 19th century, every baby put in an orphanage basically died. And that's what lack of touch will do, at least in this context. But deprivation is a really, really serious thing. So while the environment isn't everything, it's a very big deal. And along those lines of what healthy, nurturing attachment is to a baby, almost all psychological problems come down to this. I know that's a broad claim, but this is what I think I'm observing. So a child who is forced to please an adult against his true nature will be various degrees of screwed up, let's just say. If the parent has good intentions, that screwing up will be minimal. But if the parent is a narcissist, that's bad, because the mother is going to try to make the child into a mini me, or someone who can bolster the mother's narcissism, and that's going to cause all sorts of issues, because the true self is still going to be in there in the child, and when you grow up, it's going to be bugging you unconsciously, and a lot of the problems will be that your true self was never allowed to be expressed, and it kind of has to be split off, and so you will not be able to have you will not have access to your complete self to interact with the world. And this is, if you look at Freud, if you look at Carl Jung, if you look at all the theories of the great psychologists, it comes down to this: there's stuff buried in there that doesn't have a voice, that doesn't know how to express itself. It's very bad in trauma, for example. The worst case scenario, of course, is very early child abuse, which people who have had that report that they don't even have a sense of self. They don't know who they are. They never had that mirroring and nurturing to help grow themselves. So it's beyond even your true self trying to express itself. You don't even have a self. And that can be very challenging in therapy. So babies feel like it's a life or death proposition to please the parent, because it kind of is, and it's very biological. And that biological attachment to the mother is the main reason why it's so difficult in therapy to truly denounce your parents, even if they deserve it. That biological pattern runs as deep as possible. Typically, if you're working on something like this, you don't have to completely denounce and separate yourself from your parent, although in some cases it's fully appropriate. With some of the more severe cases of narcissism, sometimes you just have to cut your mother off or cut your father off, and you're going to have to make peace with that. Typically, you can compartmentalize. Most people are going to have some small or, some degree on the spectrum of some attachment disorder. It's just impossible. No one's perfect, So typically as an adult, you can compartmentalize as you see the nuance of the personality of your mother, usually a well-meaning, most of the time a well-meaning, but sometimes maybe depressed or stressed mother. And Gabor Mate in his book says his mother had all the best intentions in the world, but she was stressed out because he was born right in the war and he was Jewish. So this resulted in having to dissociate from his mother's stress. And that is a major component of ADD, which is something that many, many traumatized people have. They will also have ADD as a side diagnosis. So the last thing I want to talk about is the animal issue I was talking about in my last video. And I've come to the conclusion that what we need is some kind of necessity, maybe a regulation. If this will never happen, of course. It is so anti-profit for the meat industry, but somehow that the objectification, the reduction of animals' bodies to benign inorganic masses in plastic packages, this needs to end because we are looking at animals. This makes us, this rational, the rational knife has caused us to see animals as just inorganic bodies without sentience. And this is how we always see it. No one is ever going to see an animal getting slaughtered. And this is especially, I'm particularly sensitive to the plight of pigs because they're so much like us. Like I said, chickens is terrible, it's cruel, it's disgusting, but they only have 6 weeks of putting up with this and then it's over. And the beef industry, there is an awful lot of, it's less cruel, I think, because they're in the pasture. They have to be in the pasture for a lot of the time in a lot of the meat industry. Or they won't thrive in the same kind of environment that, other animals can thrive in. They need a little bit more of what you would say in nature, but I may be, maybe they figured out how to get around that. I don't know. But we need to understand where our meat comes from. And without truly understanding that connection, that we are just a neocortex removed from these creatures, it will be very difficult to turn this whole factory farming thing around. People, if you just see, these packages of meat, you never understand this. So I'm going to show you a photograph that I'm going to warn you, it's graphic. So look away or turn this off if you are sensitive to this kind of thing. But this is the kind of thing you probably need to see, though. So this is the circumstance where meat comes from, and I had him for dinner last night. And the experience of seeing this beautiful creature gutted and butchered, it instills in me grief, awe, and gratitude. Because if we are going to eat meat, we should be feeling that about what we eat. It's a sort of sacred, all the more primitive cultures had this connection with what they killed. I mean, you look at the cave paintings. There's a real connection that they felt that we no longer feel, and this, I think, is the problem, that we have, that we have turned these biological sentient beings into inorganic matter. So I think this is the price we need to pay, is understanding this and is being exposed to this, because, as Jaak Panksepp said, we are brothers under the skin. And again, I know that the obvious solution is vegetarianism. There are reasons in our biological nature why humanity as a species will never be fully vegetarian. And that is, of course, material for further discussions. So I hope that made sense, and I will see you next time.